Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 569, The Revolutionary, Part 4. Last week we covered one of the first major events in the age of violent student protest in Japan, the so-called Sodai struggle of 1966. That term, Sodai, is, by the way, just another way of saying Waseda University. The So is a variant reading of the Wa in Waseda, and the Dai comes from Daigaku, or university. So it's shorthand in the same way that, say, students at the University of Washington never call it that, it's always the UW. Anyway, the Sodai struggle matters for our story, of course, because Miyazaki Manabu was there for it and helped shape it in his career as a college activist. But it's also important to the wider history of this era because despite its failure to do much more than force some resignations from the University Board of Trustees and disrupt some exams, it would not be the last student protest of the era. Those protests would only grow in 1967 and especially 1968 and 69. But as they did, things would take on a different tenor. In 1966, things were still pretty, for lack of a better word, calm. Which might seem odd given the things we talked about last week, clashes between left and right-wing students, calling them the riot police, but you'll see what I mean. You see, I think the way in which Miyazaki describes the end of the Sodai struggle is particularly helpful for understanding what happens to the student movement in the coming years. Because, to spoil, I guess, some half-a-century-old history for you, that movement is going to grow very rapidly, be able to shut down a bunch of campuses across Japan, particularly in the 1968-69 academic year, and then almost as soon as that happens, it will flame out spectacularly and basically cease to be much of a political force at all. Which raises a really interesting question. What the hell happened? And that brings us back to the end of the Sodai struggle. You might remember that after February of 1966, when the university leadership made it very clear it was not going to back down in the face of student protests, a lot of students abandoned their strike, which had the goal of shutting down campus and disrupting classes, enough to force a reconsideration of a planned tuition hike for the next year. Now, in part, simple exhaustion and demoralization drove students away from the movement, but one thing I didn't mention last time, which also helped bring things to an end, was that many of the radical factions on campus actually began to abandon support for the strike as well. Why would they do that? Well, let's take, for example, Miyazaki's own faction. He was, you'll remember, a supporter of Minsei, the youth wing of the Japanese Communist Party, which alongside the youth wing of the Socialist Party, as well as a breakaway of the old Zengakuren Student Union, which was called the Marxist Student Association, was one of the three biggest political groups on Waseda's campus. Minsei had, of course, supported the student strike at Waseda at first, but actually, around this time, they pulled their support for the protests. Why? Well, because a bunch of the members of the Japanese Communist Party's Central Committee, its leadership, decided that too many of the younger members were fretting about campus politics instead of real revolution. Miyazaki and several of his colleagues, for example, actually got into it with the Central Committee because the leadership tried to order the organizers off of Waseda's campus to support a planned rally about something else altogether outside of the National Diet building during the height of the protests. Miyazaki and several of the others refused the orders of the Central Committee on the grounds that if they left campus, they were worried about students being vulnerable to a raid by the police. Miyazaki actually got ejected in his role from Waseda's communist movement leadership as a result of this disagreement. This was a moment of disillusionment for Miyazaki, who, after all, by his own recount, had been a pretty committed communist up until this point. But the fact that the party leadership was not only being critical of the student strike, but doing so for what were essentially personal reasons, wanting the students to focus more on the concerns of the Central Committee rather than concerns that were relevant to them, and that none of those leaders would listen to student arguments about why maintaining the strike was useful, really started to break his faith in the party leadership. As he later put it, by the Central Committee's insistence that we criticize ourselves and admit we were wrong, the party executives were shown up as petty mandarins. Rather than doing some serious thinking on how to develop the struggle, They just fell back on Central Committee politics. I have no doubt that self-interest was also at work, because this was how they kept their positions. But how could one expect such people to give guidance for the rest of the party? In this regard, Yakuza gangsters struck me as far superior. The directives a Yakuza executive issues and the policies he formulates in relation to a dispute can literally be a matter of life and death, as he is deciding the fate of members of his organization, not to mention his own. His decisions always involve the ultimate risk. Desperately, he tries to ascertain the position they are in, the position of the enemy, and the situation in general, in an effort to make the right call. This was also true of the pre-war communists that my father used to tell me about. But because communists were dedicated to a much bigger cause, namely revolution, I always felt they ought to be far more willing than Yakuza to lay down their lives. Moreover, I also felt they had a duty to offer direction to their members as long as they were responsible for their lives. I don't mean by this that any guidance would do, but I would have followed even a dull and plodding policy willingly if I felt it contained something worth dying for. Hence, it was a great disappointment to me that the party's policies completely lacked this. Despite this growing disillusionment, Miyazaki pointedly did not leave the Communist Party. As he later put it, he still wanted to be able to organize in the field for the movement, which was the part that mattered for him anyway. But it was the start of a drift away from total commitment to the party and to communism. And it wasn't just, by the way, Minsei that was walking back its commitment to solidarity with the wider student body and collaborating between factions in protests. Factional relations over the course of the Sodai struggle started to get much more strained as the politics between the factions turned increasingly violent. As the protest failed to materialize concrete gains, each faction began to accuse the other of betrayal, of counter-revolution, of putting their own interests above the interests of the people or the revolution or whatever. Each faction started blaming the other for the failures of the movement to extract more substantial concessions, and it didn't take very long for those disputes, of course, to turn violent. As an example, let's return to Oguchi Akihiko, the leader of Waseda's Zen Kyoto, the joint struggle committee which led the strike that guy the women's magazine described last week as so very handsome. Oguchi had been picked in part because he was a non-committed student, ideological but not factional. But over the course of the struggle, he ended up affiliating himself to Seikai, the youth wing of the Japan Socialist Party, and when the struggle ended, he stuck by Seikai, taking a lot of previously uncommitted students who'd come to admire his style with him. And this really pissed off a lot of the other factions, including one of the smaller ones at Waseda, the Kakumaruha or Central Core faction of the Zengakuren. This is one of the mini breakaways from the original Zengakuren groups. And so, the two groups, Seikai and Kakumaru, began to skirmish violently with fists or clubs against each other over the course of the next school year. And in the fall of 1967, Kakumaru undertook to crush Seikai once and for all. During a rally of 200 Seikai students outside of the administration building, Kakumaru's most committed members launched an armed raid, beating the absolute hell out of the Seikai students. Oguchi himself took a shot to the back of the head that split the skin. Only about half the Seikai students were able to escape under their own power. Miyazaki described the scene, quote, "With a blood-soaked towel wrapped around his head and a crazed look on his face, he delivered a fiery speech in front of his disheartened fellow activists. Every time he strained to speak, more blood spurted from the wound. It was an impassioned rallying cry. But Seikai still lost the battle to Kakumaru. Worse, it was now heading for defeat in the contest for power on the main campus, to the point where it was no longer able to hold a rally by itself. This was the unwritten rule of the Gibaruto encounters between factions. If you lost a battle, you not only surrendered initiative in the movement, but also your territory. It was no different to a confrontation between feudal warlords or modern-day Yakuza. Oguchi disappeared from campus. After a while, a rumor spread that his health had been permanently ruined. This distressed me greatly. Although we belonged to different factions, he was a man of integrity and a genuinely good guy. It was hard to imagine that someone so tough could end up bedridden. Coming on top of news of other activists who died or disappeared, the thought of Oguchi as an invalid left me disconsolate. Sometime later, though, word reached me that he had enrolled in Kyoto University. At first I couldn't believe it, but it was true. I heard later that Oguchi had indeed been bedridden for a long time following the violent assault by Kakumaru. Fortunately, he hadn't sustained any brain damage. After gradually pulling himself together, he studied hard for the entrance exam of Kyoto University, where he wanted to study Marxist economics all over again. I remember that all of the activists at Waseda, regardless of factional affiliation, offered him their congratulations. Now, this kind of infighting would become increasingly common among the factions. They would fight their schools, the police, but also each other with growing regularity. And in the end, that did a lot to undercut public support for the cause. But burning through the last of that goodwill was a long way off in 1968. Miyazaki later recalled the heady atmosphere of the age. Quote, "During my 50 years, I can think of 2 periods where I experienced such a rush that it felt as if the ground itself was rising up beneath me. One was the era of the asset-inflated bubble economy of the late 80s. The other was my 3rd year at university, 1968. In both instances, naked desire, violence, and aggressive self-assertiveness, normally kept in check by society, spewed out from below the surface and infected people and cities like some heady poison." In 1968, you see the student movement of which Miyazaki was a part exploded in its largest and most violent upsurges. We're not going to retrace all of them. In fact, this is probably a good place to remind you all that we did a longer series on the subject of student uprisings of the period, starting with episode 465. So if you're interested in this subject, again, episode 465, take a look there. But of course, there are a few things we do have to mention. As the student movement grew more extreme, particularly in opposition to the Vietnam War, the violence itself went beyond college campuses. On September 21, 1968, student protesters, angry at Japan's complicity in the Vietnam War, occupied Tokyo's busiest train station, Shinjuku Station, and tried to set up a liberated quarter, what they called it. When riot police intervened, the students rioted, and the riot itself happened right in the middle of the evening rush hour. The result was a street battle in the middle of rush hour between students and protesters that raged into the night while commuters were trying to get home in the middle of it. As you might imagine, it made some headlines. Larger campus protests also broke out, with the biggest in Tokyo being, of course, at Tokyo University, as well as the massive and privately funded Nihon University. Those were the biggest, but they weren't the only ones. A third school in Tokyo, Chuo University, was racked by its own student protests against a planned tuition hike, but it was never as big as the ones at Tokyo and Nihon universities, so that one tends not to get brought up as much. There were others in all of the major cities of Japan around the same time. Miyazaki absolutely threw himself into this growing atmosphere of political disturbance, undeterred by either his weakening faith in the Japanese Communist Party or by the failures of the Sodai struggle at Waseda to actually stop the tuition hike. A big part of his energies, he later said, came from the Vietnam War. By 1968, the common wisdom that raw American power would lay waste to North Vietnam and the Viet Cong was looking shaky. The Tet Offensive during the Lunar New Year of 1968, when Viet Cong guerrillas attacked all over the South, seemed to show the Americans were not making headway in the war effort. In fact, Tet actually devastated the Viet Cong's capabilities and weakened it pretty badly because the offensive was defeated pretty much everywhere, but it was a huge PR victory, showing that the Americans were not safe anywhere in Vietnam. Miyazaki and his fellow radical students were growing convinced that the American-dominated order in Asia was now teetering, and this meant they had a real chance at revolution. In retrospect, of course, we know they were jumping a couple of steps ahead, to say the least. Just because the Americans weren't making headway in Vietnam did not mean instability was coming to Japan, but at the time, the feeling, for lack of a better word, was in the air. Even the Japanese Communist Party seemed convinced. For a very long time, ever since its own failed revolution in the early 1950s, Japanese communists had taken an official stance of nonviolence. Of course, plenty of communists had been violent. Miyazaki himself talked about beating the crap out of his political opponents or getting into scuffles in the regular. We've seen that. But doing so would always invoke scrutiny from the party's central committee, which would interrogate why had the fighting been necessary, were any of the rules of engagement it had set broken. The party also refused its members the right to formally organize for any sort of violence and to use weapons in fights. You see, the increasingly militant student factions, especially the former factions of the Zengakuren, had by this time started organizing themselves for their scuffles into what you might call cohesive units with military regimentation. They trained together on fighting tactics using the preferred weapon of the student activist, the wooden stave known to those activists as the Gewarutobo or violence stick. The JCP, though, refused to allow Minsei or any part of the party to organize similar units, but by the late 60s, its activists were facing constant fights against more organized Zengakuren units. Even still, the party leadership refused to change its views until the summer of 1968, when the Communist Party leadership finally caved in and allowed the formation of what they called an action corps of students from Tokyo-based universities. Miyazaki, of course, was one of their best scrappers and given a role as a field commander of the 150 Waseda students who signed up. The communists even, and this was pretty standard for a lot of these groups, set up trips for their new fighters to, in this case, Izu Oshima Island. There they had a combination boot camp and celebration with trainings led by student activists who had martial arts backgrounds. If you're wondering, kendo and karate were apparently the most heavily represented ones. Miyazaki, of course, was a bit less refined in his teaching approach. He told his unit that his basic advice was as follows. Go for the torso with your stick, not the head, because we don't want to kill anybody. Always attack first to make sure you keep the initiative. Never back down to avoid looking weak. And finally, keep 3 big rocks in your pockets to throw as you're charging in order to create openings for attacks. Which, I mean, on balance, I guess is pretty good military advice as these things go. You're probably starting to notice a bit of a theme here. Initially, of course, student activism in the 60s had a pretty clear goal in mind, the remaking of Japanese society, the final destruction of the old modes of thinking about social orders, which had, so the notion went, led Japan into defeat and destruction during the imperial period. But divisions within the movement meant this goal, the actual ostensible point of all of these activist efforts, the revolution that Miyazaki himself talked about wanting so badly, had kind of started to fall into the background by the late 60s. Instead, disagreements between the factions and preparing yourselves to fight against them kind of became the most important thing. Those disagreements could be ideological, on questions of what exactly the new society that would emerge from the revolution would look like, particularly when you're looking at the split between the old left, generally very conventionally Marxist, and the new left, which trended more anarchist, I guess. There was a lot of ideological daylight. But the thing is, beyond that split, most of the factions actually weren't that far apart. Particularly among the Zengakuren splinter groups, where some of the biggest infighting takes place, everyone's generally Trotskyist to some degree, and I'm not going to get too in-depth on that, by the way, because the people who care more about the big distinctions frankly know it better than I do, and for everyone else, an in-depth lecture on the gradations of Marxist ideology is probably not what you're here for. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but with apologies to the Marxists in the audience, I'm pretty sure I'm not. The factional differences were frankly at this point increasingly based around personal acrimony and personality politics. The various factional leaders on campus had argued and fought so much that their battles became questions of personal influence more than anything. Increasingly, factions on campus were busy not fighting the system, the police, even campus administration. They were fighting each other in battles over who had betrayed who at what point in the struggle, over long-standing grudges to do with control of the student government, over slights and betrayals that amounted to counter-revolutionary activity. As Miyazaki himself started to note, the atmosphere was dominated more and more not by a belief in a better future or an ideological yearning for the remaking of Japanese society, but simply by an enjoyment of violence for its own sake. That whole process had really reached its sort of climax by the time Miyazaki took his first 150 Action Corps students into the fray, as part of one of the biggest moments in the history of the student movement, the Todai struggle. Now, Todai, like Sodai, is short for a place, in this case Tokyo University. We've talked about the Tokyo University struggle before. I don't want to rehash it too much, but it's worth quickly reminding you of the context. So, Tokyo University was, and still is, the most prestigious school in Japan. It is still the highest ranked university in the whole country, and in the 1960s, 10% of the national education budget that went to public universities and colleges went to Tokyo University. The protest movement at Tokyo University, which culminated in the establishment of a Zen Kyoto, a joint struggle committee, to coordinate a struggle against the university leadership, was, like many others during this period, a product of overbearing and cost-cutting attitudes within the university leadership. The issue began with the school's medical students, who were subject to a rigorous 6-year internship program that essentially forced them to engage in free labor for the university and its affiliated hospitals. In January 1968, the school, under pressure, agreed to reform the program, but the reforms didn't go far enough for a lot of the medical students, who went on strike indefinitely as a result. The strike lasted too. In mid-February, some of the involved students met with a tutor hired by the school to talk things over, and somehow, it's not entirely clear how, that talk became a fight. It's still not entirely clear what happened, who threw the first punch, but things got violent, and then the school clamped down. 17 medical students who were seen as ringleaders of the protest movement were punished. 4, including one who was not even in Tokyo when this happened but was home in Kyushu visiting family, were labeled as the instigators and were expelled. This, you might not be surprised to hear, didn't do much to alleviate the tensions in the medical school, and student protesters repeatedly tried to disrupt the March 1968 graduation ceremonies, and then in June they occupied the campus's most famous building, Yasuda Hall, this gorgeous red brick structure built in the 1920s with money from the massive Yasuda Zaibatsu. The university president, Okochi Kazuo, responded by calling in the riot police to storm Yasuda Hall and arrest all of the students, and that led to a wide-ranging strike outside of the medical school, which basically ended up shutting down Tokyo University for the entirety of the 1968 to 1969 academic year. By the late summer of 1968, Miyazaki and his Action Corps were mobilized to join the Todai struggle, but not for the reason you are thinking. In fact, the Communist Party called them in to fight against the largest faction of students on campus and the Zen Kyoto, the joint struggle committee that was coordinating them. So why then? Well, like at Waseda, the striking students at Tokyo University had set up their own Zen Kyoto, the joint struggle committee, to manage their collective efforts. And here's where we get into the petty factional rivalries, because the Tokyo University Zen Kyoto ended up being heavily dominated by militant students from the New Left, which really upset the Japanese Communist Party because Tokyo University had traditionally been a hotbed of old left Communist Party affiliated students. But the party's long delay on taking a stance on political violence had really hurt it on this campus, particularly as the political temperature turned up with growing anger at the university administration. And so, the more extreme New Left Zengakuren leadership at Tokyo University ended up taking control of the Zen Kyoto, and they announced a plan in September to blockade the entire Tokyo University campus to force the university leadership to bargain. The Communist Party objected to this on the grounds that shutting down campus was counterproductive to the actual point of the struggle, which was getting the administration to bargain with students. How could they do that if, in these dark days before the invention of Zoom, the administration couldn't even get on campus to talk to students and hear their demands? Which, I mean, yeah, is a fair point, though much as had been the case with the Waseda struggle, there was also no way a school leadership dominated mostly by conservative old men of the pre-war set was going to negotiate anyway, and really it's pretty clear in retrospect that what actually upset the Japanese Communist Party is the fact that it had been frozen out of control of a student movement inside of a school that was traditionally its territory. And so the Japanese Communist Party organized its fighters not to help the Tokyo University Zen-Kyoto students, but to fight against them. Specifically, Miyazaki's contingent was to prevent the Zen-Kyoto from shutting down one of the most important institutions on campus, the University of Tokyo Hospital. Reading Miyazaki's account of this first battle, if one could call it that, makes it hard to escape the feeling that this whole thing was just a posturing exercise in the aesthetics, the appearance of macho violence. By his recollection, 300 students were mobilized by the communists for the fight, plus another 200 who came over from communist-affiliated youth groups in Kyoto and Osaka. Waiting for Miyazaki when he got to the meeting place was a Coca-Cola delivery van filled with gewarutobo and helmets, a fixture of student factional battles of the period, because of course, theoretically, they prevented more serious injuries. But both Miyazaki and most of his followers refused to wear the safety gear, because unlike the Zen-Kyoto fighting squads, who all had different colored helmets and slogans based on what faction of students they were affiliated with, these were just yellow construction helmets. The general attitude of his followers, as he put it, was, "What the hell are these? We're not bloody construction workers." Which, by the way, is a bit rich coming from communists. They are supposed to be representatives of the workers, but fortunately, the lack of safety gear didn't end up mattering that much. The job of the Action Corps was to protect a group of Minsei students who were peacefully demonstrating to keep the hospital open. About 2 hours in, 100 Tokyo University Zen-Kyoto students, armed with sticks and helmets of their own, showed up and started attacking the peaceful protesters, and Miyazaki and his followers went in. But the Zen-Kyoto students retreated without putting up a fight, which Miyazaki was furious about. He called it pure cowardice, and a sign of contempt for the communists and their general unwillingness to use violence. And by the way, you probably are wondering, where are the cops in all of this? Why are they just letting these students beat on each other like this? The answer is the cops generally didn't intervene in these protests unless they were called in by university administration, for example to clear out an occupied building, for a couple of reasons. First, the police as an institution in Japan, as pretty much everywhere else, were not super well disposed to the hot-headed radicals of the 1960s, and so when those radicals started fighting each other, the general feeling was, let them do it. Larger actions that were disruptive off campus or affected outside life in the city, for example that big occupation of Shinjuku Station on October 21st, 1960, those got a police response. Something like this wouldn't. But it's also worth noting that despite their violent nature, these student clashes didn't usually result in deaths, generally speaking. Before 1970, only one student that we know of actually died as a result of the fighting, a Chuo University student who'd been a member of a militant Old Left group, the Sekigunha or Red Army faction, and who was kidnapped by a New Left group, the Second Bund, and fell out of a second-story window trying to escape, dying of his injuries as a result. To be clear, that doesn't make all this violence okay. The images of it, in fact, did a lot to turn public opinion, previously favorable towards idealistic young students, staunchly against them, but it does explain perhaps why the police felt less of a sense of urgency to deal with the issue every time students started fighting. Anyway, shortly after the showdown at the hospital, Miyazaki's Action Corps was deployed once again to Yasuda Hall, still occupied by Zen-Kyoto activists. Miyazaki and the other Action Corps leaders were hoping to end the disrespect of the new left Zen-Kyoto factions against the communists by first provoking a fight, and then beating the crap out of them. Unfortunately, it didn't work for two reasons. First, the Zen-Kyoto fighters, perhaps out of shock because they were not used to communists actually looking for a fight, kept their distance at first. And second, when Zen-Kyoto members did actually start to harass Miyazaki and his Communist Action Corps, the Communist Party leaders who'd shown up to command them ordered them not to retaliate for fear of damaging the party's reputation by escalating. Miyazaki and his little foot soldiers were, of course, furious. I'll let him describe what came next. Quote, "No wonder my fighters were angry. They had been mobilized. They had turned up for the demonstration. yet here they were asked to not respond to being kicked. The rain, which was falling incessantly, just aggravated them further. I decided to act. "Everyone stay put," I said, and I set out towards the Zenkyoto mob. In my hand, I held a wooden sword with a strip of lead embedded in the core. I stopped by the JCP leader who'd been preaching restraint. "You don't seem to know the old saying," I said, "never be slow to respond to provocation." He just stared back at me foolishly, his mouth wide open. I walked up to the Zenkyoto student who'd been harassing us the most. "Shut it," I said to his face. Before he could utter more than a couple of words, I brought the wooden sword down on top of his skull. I thought I'd been quite restrained, but he fell to the ground clutching his head, blood gushing from between his fingers. The other Zenkyoto activists pushed up on me. "What the F," that's the translation I have, "do you think you're doing? What if he dies? If he dies, then he'll be dead and he'll be given a funeral. Do the rest of you want some as well?" It was a threat I'd often used in my delinquent days. I don't know why, but it just popped out of my mouth at that moment. Angrily, they all stared back at me. Miyazaki's actions, of course, triggered a flurry of retaliation from the Tokyo University Zenkyoto. Their student paper referred to the communist students from Waseda and the other schools as a foreign legion invading campus, unacceptably involving themselves in an issue no one outside of Tokyo University should have a stake in. Zenkyoto students started attacking Minsei and communist territories, both on the main Tokyo University campus and the attached Kamaba campus. Miyazaki himself came under fierce denunciation from the Communist Party's leadership, who accused him of taking things too far, but he was deeply unrepentant. As he put it to one of his communist critics from Tokyo University, quote, "Quite a lot of your comrades were injured by Zenkyoto. Preaching humanism and compassion is all very well, but you've got to understand that this is a crude political struggle. If you let them take you lightly, that'll be the end of your organization." Miyazaki's narrative of the next couple of months is fascinating, but it's also a tangled tour through the complex recriminations and divisions of the student movement. To be honest, I think what we've already talked about gives you a good sense of those things, but there's one more battle, I guess is the word, that I do want to talk about. This was over the main campus library, which the Tokyo University Zenkyoto announced that it was going to close starting on November 12th. In part because of the symbolic importance of the library as a center of campus, but also because it was where the unaffiliated students who didn't care about the strike and were just trying to get through their classes tended to congregate. And so Miyazaki and his Action Corps took it upon themselves to defend the library. It's not clear to me whether he'd been ordered to do this by higher-ups in the party, but it does seem pretty clear to me he wouldn't really have cared either way. Miyazaki describes the battle in great detail, claiming to have routed an evenly matched Zenkyoto force by baiting them into an attack up the library steps and catching them in a pincher. It's a fascinating account of what a skirmish on campus looked like, but I want to focus in on a few key things in particular. First, Miyazaki specifically notes that several professors and unaffiliated students were nearby, encouraging students, without success of course, to stop fighting and put down their weapons. Right by them on the sidelines of the battle were photographers from the press documenting the fighting, and the very next day the Mainichi Shimbun ran an article on it that Miyazaki includes in part in his book. I want to include it here because I think it gives a great sense of how all this was being portrayed in the mass media, what you'd be hearing about this if you were a regular person going about your day. So here's the article with the extremely journalistically neutral title, "Seat of Learning Seized by Hatred and Anarchy." Yesterday, a number of students were seen on campus carrying wooden staves in preparation for anticipated skirmishes. The lengths of timber prepared by the Zenkyoto camp included some gruesome weapons, with thin iron points protruding from iron-encased tips. Others had nails hammered into them. "These weapons are just too much. You could kill someone," an unhappy student warned a masked and helmeted demonstrator in front of the general library. "I don't give a damn," he yelled back. The reply was devoid even of humanity's minimum rule, respect for the lives of others. Students of the communist groups were armed similarly. At a whistle blast from their leader, that's Miyazaki, they threw firecrackers to blind their opponents and brandished their wooden staves. At 8:45 p.m., he blew a noticeably long note on his whistle. It was a signal for the start of their full-scale offensive. They were well led and moved like a highly trained combat unit. No matter the reasons and claims put forward by these scuffling students, the fact is that an ugly scene little different from the Yakuza duels depicted in B-movies took place right in front of the main entrance to the library, a symbol of learning, on the main campus of the University of Tokyo, Japan's highest seat of learning. The language is, of course, a little over the top, but I do think it's worth considering how all this looked to an outsider. It's hard to view violent street battles between students, practically children, as just harmless activism. This looks, and frankly kinda is, violence for its own sake. Going forward, the communists in Zenkyoto would skirmish constantly across Tokyo University's campus, basically a whole separate side battle alongside the main battle between the Zenkyoto and the school administration. And by the end, it seems pretty clear, reading Miyazaki's accounts, reading other accounts of this fighting, that after a point, the actual ideological questions didn't really matter. This was all about a personal battle between the old left communists and the new left Zenkyoto, and the personal rivalries and acrimony that came out of it. Miyazaki himself seems to confirm this pretty clearly. He says repeatedly in his account of this period that, quote, when push comes to shove, military force is what matters, and describes new left intellectuals, who would often gather in cafes around the University of Tokyo to comment on matters, as irrelevant prattlers who were, quote, nothing but a joke. Ultimately, the Sodai struggle, as it's known, worked out okay for Minsei and the communists. The Zenkyoto was able to call up thousands of fighters from the university New Left groups to combat the communists, but before long, they turned on each other. Instances of uchigeba, internal violence, infighting between the factions supporting the Zenkyoto, became increasingly common, and at the same time, threats from the administration and from the education ministry to just cancel graduation or close the University of Tokyo started driving more and more students away from the strike. The communists became one of the groups backing a negotiated settlement with school leadership. Miyazaki and his Action Corps actually defended students who met with school leaders on January 10th and 11th from Zenkyoto attacks. And in the end, shortly thereafter, most students voted to end the strike, and the most extreme holdouts, who bunkered down in Yasuda Hall on the main campus, were cleared out by riot police 7 days later. Miyazaki's side had won, kind of, but won what exactly? How was any of this furthering any cause? We'll talk a bit more about that question next week. For now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show at facingbackward.com, and you can support us on Patreon. Special thanks to new patron Sebastian for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for part 5.